fantastic talk for you by Kristen Rodzinka, Joanna McCormick, and Shiloh Jordan, entitled Remediation as a Process, 7 Steps for Successful Remediation. And I'll provide a little bit more in terms of introductions in just 1 minute. But I first just want to review some basic Zoom etiquette, which hopefully is all secondhand to you all, but this is a meeting, so please keep yourself muted. Use the speaker view if at all possible. And if you become unmuted, we'll just try to mute you just to eliminate any background noise. To view captions, you can use the closed caption option on your Zoom toolbar. Please use the chat box for any questions or comments that you have during the presentation. I'll be moderating the chat, and we really actually also encourage you to participate if there are questions asked by the presenters. If you have questions, please save them to the end. We'll leave time for questions and answers, and again, you can use the chat box, and if you choose to speak, you can just unmute yourself and turn your video on. And as you saw earlier by the pop-up, this webinar is being recorded. So if you want to refer back to it later or direct any of your peers to it, it will be up on the APIC website. Continuing education. If you registered, you will receive an email after the webinar today to complete an evaluation so you can receive CE credit. And if there's any handouts, they'll be made available as well to you. So just again, you've met Jeff Baker, who is the executive director. I see Shona Voss is on the call. She's the APIC chair. And again, I'm Amy Silverbogen, a board member. I'm going to skip over the objectives because I know the speakers have those embedded in their slide deck as well. I'm just going to really briefly introduce these fantastic leaders. Shiloh Jordan is the director of training for the VA Pacific Islands Healthcare System Psychology Internship and Residency Program. She's also the current chair of the VA PTC. Joanna McCormick is the director of the psychology training programs at the Montana VA Healthcare System. She has served on so many different committees of the VA PTC and currently moderates the Small and Rural VA Training Committee. And Kristen Rodzinka is the training director of the internship program at the Dayton VA. She's also the trauma recovery programs manager and is enjoying the good life of past chair of the VA Psychology Training Council. So welcome. Thank you, Shiloh, Joanna, and Kristen for joining us today and sharing your knowledge on remediation. Really appreciate and look forward to learn from you. I am going to stop sharing my screen so Kristen, you can start sharing yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy, for the nice introduction. And if anyone figures out how you get to the past chair role without having to take on the chair responsibilities the year before, I want you to back channel and share the good news. So always a challenge. Let me see. And it's the end of the day at the end of the week. So if I can make the tech work right, then I'm going to consider everything about this presentation a win. All right, we good to go? Slides up or not yet? Yes? Woohoo! All right, I see thumbs up. Well, I want to thank everybody for spending the time. I know that there are lots of other things you could be doing. This is one of those topics that I feel like there's this dubious distinction of having some expertise in remediation. As I was thinking about our slides deck that we had put together, I keep reflecting on the growth of my program here in Dayton as a training committee. This is a process we're going to talk about, so I have some steps to help you think through the entire sequence of things. But I also just want to validate that these are skills that can be developed and built upon. Every time we do it, we get a little bit better. And I use the word we with a lot of intention because training directors alone cannot a successful remediation make. And so I think training committees and sort of the community within which you provide those services, I think are an integral part of doing this. So if this is daunting or scary or something you've only done a couple of times or it didn't go well, I'm glad that you're with us, and I hope you stick with it and just recognize that these are things that can build. The good news is as programs build these skills, you can bring in new people, and then they can learn from the other people involved in that. So that's my off-script introduction before we even get started. And I think you'll find that Shiloh and Joanna and I will happily communicate throughout the talk with just thoughts and ideas we have in addition to our slides. So I know Amy asked that you wait to ask questions to the end. In terms of like joining the actual presentation, we'll ask you to wait to the end. But by all means, if you have questions or comments relevant to what we're talking about right now, please use the chat ongoing throughout the talk so that we can incorporate that into what we're discussing. And we would appreciate it. I think it will make our talk better. So our learning objectives today are, first, to identify at least 3 training program infrastructure requirements that are necessary to support successfully addressing problematic training behavior. And so I think recognizing is that there's some groundwork and foundation that needs to be laid in place before you can do the other things is super important. The next one is to describe at least 2 warning signs that you may need to consider remediation. So like, what are the red flags? What are the things that should make you as a training director or training committee think, oh, we maybe need to start thinking about doing that. And then thirdly, describe how clinical supervisors demonstrate diversity competency within the context of supervision, particularly as it pertains to when there are problems and maybe a need for remediation. So our disclaimer is we really don't have a disclaimer. The things we are going to talk about are our own views, our own opinions. We're not necessarily trying to represent the views of our individual VAs or the VA at large. We don't have any financial interests or other book deals in play, unfortunately. So that's all we got. So why should we do this? Why should we do this talk? Why should we think about remediation? Want to acknowledge that this is hard. Nobody goes into training with the goal of dealing with complex problems. No one says, yay, I can't wait to do my remediation plan. Never heard anyone say that ever. But ultimately, not doing it is harder. So I'm going to pitch the very beginning of this talk, requesting you put some things in the chat. So what are some of the costs of avoiding whether you call it remediation or addressing problem behavior, what are some of the costs of pretending like it's not there and not doing anything? I'm going to give everybody a minute. Take a sip. If you've been doing this a minute, I know it's happened to you. You're like, oh, I just pretend like it's not happening. All right, well, I'm hoping some chats will roll in. I don't see them yet.
There's a bunch, Kristen.
There's a bunch. Why don't I see them?
You might have to open your little chat box at the bottom. But there are all sorts of ones like problems getting worse, not preserving the reputation of the program.
Patient safety.
Yeah.
All right.
Do you want me to read them, or I mean, Shiloh's got it.
Yeah. It always gets worse. Patient safety issues, harm to patients, a lot of the problems getting worse, impacting other trainees, utilization of greater staff resources, bigger issues even fixed later, ethical responsibilities. A lot of it's the work, the morale issues, the impact.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I don't know why. I was like seeing a couple things, but not the rest of the chat. So we will have to help on that. So yeah. Distress definitely, I think, is huge. The longer we let things go, one of the things that happens is everybody's stress load goes up. The trainee's stress load goes up. The supervisor's stress load goes up. The training director, as a result, the entire training community. Sometimes I think we forget, and this isn't directly addressed as often in our slide deck today, but the other trainees too. So it's not just the individual that's having a problem that it impacts. It can really impact the entire system within which you're doing training. It really is not less time when you let things wait. The bigger those problems get, the harder they get to resolve, the more complex, the more time it takes. So again, I think this idea, if I just wait, maybe I won't have to deal with it, typically it does not work so well. And then really the saddest part is the cost of avoiding it can be worse outcomes. If we don't address things early on, sometimes we don't have the same opportunities to correct things. And at the end of the day, the goal of remediation is success. And I think maybe that's the most important thing for us to remember. And that I do think is embedded throughout our slide deck and that we will talk about. I think on the rare occasion where that is not possible, then it presents the path to gatekeeping. But for the most part, the purpose of remediation is to remediate and address and solve the problems so that the program is successful, the trainee is successful, and the competencies are met. So I think staying focused on that is really important. And then again, and this was spoken to in the chat, it sounds like it really is our legal and ethical responsibility to address training issues as they arise, not only for the gatekeeping function, but because it's the right thing to do for our trainees and the patients that they're serving. So, all right. So why 7 steps? This was an idea that came up as thinking about like what are some of the sequence and what is the process that needs to be in place, because actually for many of us, for those of us presenting today, serving in consulting and mentoring roles, we hear a lot of people asking for sample remediation plans. Oh my gosh, there's this problem. Do you have a sample remediation plan? Which I'm going to translate to, we have a problem, I don't know what to do. Can you show me what a good remediation plan looks like? Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It is helpful. I have found it helpful to be able to see other people's sample remediation plans. They've informed what we do at our site. I will admit to having a modified version of the one on the APIC site. So thank you, APIC, and whoever created that one. But what we realize is that there are a lot of pitfalls in just thinking that that's the only piece. The plan itself is a part of a much larger process. And so to be successful with remediation, I think we need to be doing is look at this as sort of a sequence of steps with the remediation plan itself maybe sitting in the middle, but with things that need to happen before and after we issue a remediation plan for a trainee. So recognizing it's a complex process and it needs to be an individualized process. Again, a sample suggests that here's the thing, but we forget that what one remediation plan looks like shouldn't necessarily be a good role model for what another one, maybe the format, but the content should really be different from trainee to trainee. And so we want to make sure that we recognize that it's stressful, that if you know what to do, everything becomes less stressful. So if we can have a flow chart that shows all the essential steps, we know what to do, then I think that it decreases the load on everybody. So here is what we have developed as the process for remediation. The first part, and we're going to go through all 7 steps, is just setting the stage, laying the foundation. Next, identifying if there even is a problem. Then determining what kind of a problem you have, since that will inform what you do next. Figuring out who needs to do what. So what is the next thing that's going to happen? Who needs to be involved? Then the 5th step is the actual remediation. That's where the remediation plan sits. So you can see where if where we're starting is at step 5, we might not be setting ourselves up for as much success as we would like. Then after the actual remediation itself, then there really still needs to be follow-up. So what happens next? What happens after that plan is put into place? And then moving into success or termination when that's required. So why should we do this? Trainees get the feedback, help, and support that they need. Reduces everybody's distress. Can serve an important gatekeeping role. And please recognize that none of us presenting today are saying that this is a rigid or sequential process that you have to follow straight through from A to Z. There may be lots of reasons to be going back and forth a bit, and that is totally fine. So no one is claiming that this is always smooth and a direct path. All right, digging in. Step 1, the step that our APIC colleagues are going to be really happy to see, I think, because definitely is consistent with some of our APIC membership criteria. Do you, in fact, have the policies and procedures you need in place? And I might even add, and will they work? You can laugh. We have a policy. Here it is. I have the policy. Okay, is the policy going to work? First and foremost, you've got to have a due process policy. Obviously, that's an APIC membership criteria. Hopefully, everybody knows that you need to have one. If you don't, let me tell you, you must have one, both to meet your criteria, but also because it is what's going to save you. The due process is what protects students and makes sure that you have a clearly defined process that is fair, and that trainees know what to expect and how that process is supposed to flow. So make sure you have a due process policy. And then I suggest, if you have the pleasure of not having to run through it under fire, try to do it when things are going smoothly and run amok. Use an example of, if things go horribly wrong and the wheels are falling off the bus, what are we going to do? And follow your own policy. And see how well it works. Maybe you're missing steps that should be explicit. Maybe something you say you're going to do, you can't really do because of some systems issues. So it sounded good when the person initially wrote it, but there are some barriers to implementing. All those things can create a ton of extra stress. And what you will find if you consult with your training director colleagues at other sites is the sites with the best due process procedures and policies are the ones that have painfully had to use them. So grievance policy is also making sure that the trainees know what to do if they don't agree with what you're doing. That I think making sure that's in place is an important counterpoint to the what are you going to do if you have a problem with them. Make sure that your public materials have clear expectations. You know, if you don't clarify what you expect and then you're surprised that the trainee is not meeting those expectations, there's a really important disconnect there. So I want to make sure that that all is in alignment. Having a trainee handbook with clear expectations. So less the public materials for applicants, but more once the trainees get there. I know that what we have in our public materials online is different than the level of detail I have once you get here and what is expected of you and the supervisors and the training program. Making sure that your competency evaluations have clear benchmarks. How are you and the trainee going to know that they have done the thing that you're telling them they have to do? Making sure that that is clear to everybody involved. And then consistent with APA SOA standards, there've got to be minimum levels of achievement that are clearly defined for successful completion of your internship or fellowship postdoc. These are not partial credit assignments, internship and fellowship in particular, that they're pass fail. So at what point have I not met that threshold to move on and graduate from the program? And then I think a part of that too is having a plan for regularly reviewing trainee progress. And we don't only mean regular points of evaluation, although we do mean that, but also, like, does your training committee meet once a month and discuss how people are doing? How do you make sure that people are where they need to be at? How are you going to identify that there's a problem before the wheels have completely fallen off the bus? So what if you haven't set up in place, and is it sufficient to meet the needs for your training program? So after you've done that, how do you work with your supervisors? Supervisors need help too and support. Hopefully I'm speaking to colleagues who understand this. I have fantastic psychologists on my training committee. I wouldn't trade them for anything. They have not spent a tremendous amount of time reading my trainee handbook, even though I send it to them. So making sure that we talk with our supervisors. Thank you. I at least see a couple of people chuckling. Yeah, it's kind of like saying, yeah, read lots of things. People are busy, they have full clinical loads, and they're happy to provide supervision, but don't necessarily go through and remind themselves and orient themselves to everything that they're supposed to do. I know in our program, we have a lot of checklists, like start of supervision checklists, but in our training committee, part of what we need to do is then go through and remind supervisors and tell and train new supervisors what the expectations are, not only of the trainees, but of them. Reminders to use a formal supervision contract and to be working with the trainees to collaboratively establish training goals. Again, back to that clear, really defined expectations. This is what they expect of us. This is what we expect of them. Everybody being on the same page. The more you do this up front, the less likely you are going to need to be finding yourself at step 5. We would highly recommend that you document supervision notes. Different states have different rules and requirements for that. I'm not going to tell you how you need to do that. I know I have suggestions for my training committee, but I don't require a specific format, just that they do those things. But again, being able to track what's going on and what you as a supervisor are doing, I think letting the supervisors know that's a need and an expectation is helpful. Again, doing that before there's a problem, not waiting to do those things until after there is a problem. Making sure we're anchoring feedback and training experiences to the competencies, and talking with the trainees at, talking with the supervisors about what those minimum levels of achievement are. I'll get to trainees. I'm getting ahead of myself. So that the supervisors know that this is part of what they need to be thinking about. Training is a developmental process, but like, where is the line? And I know that there's been a lot of us that have done work on establishing a more competency-based supervision framework. I think that can be extremely helpful in working with your supervisors, since that framework will support everything else that we were going to be talking about. One of the resources that we mentioned in the reference section is a supervisor self-assessment tool that is based on the competency-based supervision guidelines put out by APA and BEA. We are going to share that current version of that, Jeff, with APIC, so that if people want access to the slides at the end, they can also use that and freely use that with your training committees. I know we use that in our supervision consultation meetings, and it's extremely helpful because it keeps us anchored to the supervision competencies and makes us better supervisors. And then again, reminders to supervisors. Supervisors are busy. They're trying to do 800 things. Got to provide ongoing and timely feedback to the trainees, but also to the training committee and to the training director. I have some supervisors that are really, really good about providing timely feedback to supervisees in their actual supervision sessions, but then forget that they should be communicating with me in the training. Oh, I couldn't make the PTC meeting and I didn't communicate with you. And then I, as a training director, need to go back and be stalking them a little bit so that I know that everything is on track and on point with that rotation. So again, I think having mechanisms in place, but reminding your supervisors that it really is important for them to do that, both when things are going well, as well as when they have concerns or have serious concerns. At this point, I also want to jump in and start talking about the role of diversity. One of the things that we know is that supervisees report wanting to talk about diversity issues, and that the competence of supervision addressing these issues also predicts a whole lot of other positive factors in supervision. And as we start the training year, we're going to talk about how diversity is playing a role within the relationship between the trainee and the supervisor, not just diversity issues as it pertains to the patients that they see. And I think this is important because sometimes we get really focused on diversity competence as being about attending to diversity issues of the patients we provide care for. 100% important, do that. But also it's about our diversity variables. I had a conversation literally this afternoon with a trainee I've been providing backup supervision for, and my pace and her pace are not well aligned. And we were able to talk about it and do some problem solving about how we can work better together during this brief period where I'm covering for someone who is absent. It was an important conversation to have. What we were doing wasn't working. So a lot of diversity competence starts with the supervisor modeling respect, openness about diversity issues, curiosity, being able to talk about my diversity factors, what works well for me, pulling for and inviting the trainee to talk about what works well for them, what they need, how it might look different. We are not the same as our trainees. If nothing else, we at least have some age or time, not necessarily chronological age, but experience level differences that might impact how we function. So we want to be having dialogues about diversity and multicultural identities of the supervisor and supervisee, and modeling some self-reflectivity, modeling transparency, asking thoughtful questions. And this is important to talk about now at the front end, because this needs to be a critical piece throughout all of these other steps of the remediation process. Because how people learn, what they need in order to be successful, isn't always going to look the same. So one student with the exact same performance problem, so maybe it's the same competency that there's a deficit between two trainees, but what each of them needs in order to be successfully remediated is going to look different. I think that's really critical to be starting to think about. We can't cookie cutter everybody into the same mold. So once we've got our program structure in place and we're setting the stage with our supervisors, then as we orient new trainees into a new training class, we want to make sure that we're, again, laying some foundations with the trainees themselves, explicitly orienting them to expectations. And I would say verbally and in writing is important at the front end. What do they need to do in order to be successful and complete? It should be really plain. Reviewing that grievance and due process procedure with them. I literally talk with my trainees about that within the first 2 days they are here, and explain what would happen. And I even will talk to them about if it gets to this point, the whole point of the exercise is going to be to help you be successful, not to pick on you or set you up. Like that this is because we want to help. So already sort of planting the seeds of how I see remediation and what our process looks like and why we might employ that in the future if necessary. Be sure there are opportunities provided by the program for each trainee to develop and demonstrate all required competencies. We cannot ding and remediate a trainee because they have a deficit in a skill that we have not given them an opportunity to develop or demonstrate competency in. It's one of those weird things, but I think we get too far along and we haven't addressed all those profession-wide competencies and made sure they're appropriate experiences. So we want to work with them. That needs to be part of their training plan. So that's one of the things to pay attention to. And then also making sure trainees understand the function and process of evaluation at your site. Why do you have the ratings you do? What do they mean? How do they relate to the minimum levels of achievement? How do they relate to their developmental goals? What do we even mean by competencies? I know we'd like to think that they all know and understand that by the time they get to us, but that is not always true. Being able to reflect that the process is developmental, that we are looking for growth, and that we're willing to help people grow and develop while they're in our training programs, and even talking to them about how and why we use their feedback to us. So again, all of that, I think just front end goes a long way. Programs that are going to struggle with remediation processes or be more likely to be caught in remediation often haven't done these things or haven't done them as well. And then we end up cleaning that up before the next one, hopefully. The good news, bad news is you have actually a lot of friends, I think, in this training community. So as you look at these things, if you find yourself like, I don't know if this due process really would work, I encourage you to reach out and ask for consultation, mentorship, and support with any of these tasks, as it makes a big difference. All right. So,
what do you mean when you say, will this due process work? What does that mean, work?
So you would be surprised how often the due process that is laid out in writing in our training manuals and procedures might not actually function in your environment. So it might be as like, I'm going to use the VA as an example. If I put, then they can go to HR in my due process, I see VA people laughing. Like, it's going to be a problem. Big VA federal HR has no business being a part of the due process for a trainee at our site. Maybe the designated education officer does, but not our human resources department. It needs to be trainee specific. The place I did internship at, HR, it might have been appropriate. So it's really context dependent. So I'm not telling you what is or isn't appropriate. I'm saying make sure that what you have in there makes sense. What happens if you have to appeal? Do you have appropriate people designated for the appeal process? If you're at a site that's never actually fully implemented your due process procedure before, you might find that if you tried to run it, like it actually doesn't work. Maybe there's not the right person. Our lead psychologist is also a member of the training committee. So if we're trying to escalate above the training committee, because the training committee is the initial deciding body, then does there need to be someone above that person who's involved? And if so, who is it? And is that person vested and able to serve that function? And is it a person or is it a title? And so I think that there's just a lot of complicating factors. Often too, we just miss steps. So things that we think, well, obviously we would do that. Maybe we haven't written into the actual policy, and we should. So I think when I talk about missing steps, it might be things that are obvious to you, but might not be obvious to someone else. And when I talk about it not working, I mean, literally sometimes the things we say we're going to do wouldn't work. Does that help? I see some thumbs ups, so that's good. Yeah, again, I think until you're like eyeball deep in it, especially with a significant problem, it's like, oh, this looks fine. And then when you're really trying to implement it under duress, especially if there are some significant competency problems, it can be really, really hard. That's not when you want to learn your due process doesn't work. Okay. I appreciate the question. So the other thing I think in terms of working with trainees before we even get started can be helpful is recognizing that we have needs as humans, and so do trainees. I'm sitting right now at my stand-up desk that I was able to get from our reasonable accommodation officer because I sit 9 hours a day and my back is jacked up. You know, talk with trainees at the front end about reasonable accommodations and how to request them. All the better if you can normalize that and make it not something that is unnecessarily stigmatizing or weird, right? I've got a reasonable accommodation. If you need one, you can ask for one too. And this is how you do it. And obviously, if you don't, you shouldn't use my example. But I think having a way of making that, making the reasonable accommodation actually seem reasonable and not something frightening or something that they're going to get judged for, offer to help for that in the ways that are appropriate within your site, providing information about employee assistance programs or other supportive resources. You know, this has been true all along, but I got to tell you, this past couple of years, like, it's been rough. I think like we are all feeling it. I'm going to assume everyone in this room is like tired and maybe a little burnt out and frustrated and exhausted, and sometimes we need some extra support, and our trainees are under a tremendous amount of stress under the best of circumstances, and now we're asking them to do training under like circumstances none of us ever even conceived of being possible. People to be experiencing depression or anxiety or other kinds of stressors or just needing some additional support, I think is super reasonable. Letting people know that, because often those are the things that then get in the way while someone's in training. Oh, I hear dogs. At the front end of training, attending to cultural issues and sharing about cultural norms within your program or area. And I'm going to use that term culture pretty broadly. There can be individual differences based on race, ethnicity, religious background, any kind of factors, but also I think looking at group differences, an environment of care differences. So, for example, graduate school culture is extremely different than VA culture. In graduate school, you go where you need to be when you need to be there, and when you're done working, you can leave and nobody cares as long as you're doing all the things. And in VA, we have a tour of duty, and you're expected to be here before 8 o'clock and ready to work, and you're supposed to work until at least 4:30. And then, and if you leave in the middle of the day, then you need to take leave in 15-minute increments and let everyone know. And it's like, whoa, wait, what? And sometimes people aren't used to that, and it can be a huge culture shock. And I'll speak to my site. There's even very different cultures on each rotation. So primary care mental health integration versus a geropsychology rotation in our nursing home environment versus a PTSD specialty clinic are really different. So not just the like, how do you do the documentation being different, but like the culture of how the team functions and the level of formality or informality and how you consult. can look different in different environments. So recognizing that, I think, can be super helpful, and working with trainees to be able to adapt and adjust and be effective within the culture and the expectations of the norms where they are. I think, again, starts those conversations early on, normalizes the fact that everybody is not the same. And I think there are even opportunities to talk about some like the individual differences and how people who may be used to being, say, more assertive versus less assertive, which can be cultural, it can be personality, it can have a huge impact on how people are perceived and function in environments, both directions, right? Positive and negative on both extremes. And then I think it's also worth talking about some generational differences. There's some really good books about some of that, but you know, we do have different expectations and norms within different educational groups. And what some people perceive as problematic, other people perceive as normal or positive. And I think we just need to make some thoughtful reflections about that, both so that we are not inappropriately judging or punishing people for just being different, as opposed to being really focused on the competencies and how competencies are met. All right, so that's a whole lot. And what I'll say is step one is actually one of our biggest steps. And hopefully the reason appears evident now as we go through some of this. All of this foundational work will prepare you for everything else that needs to come afterwards. It will serve also your trainees who don't have competency problems, and will reduce stress for the trainees, the supervisors, and the program if you have those things in place. So I always say, if you have the ability to stack the deck, I'm a card player, stack the deck, give yourself all the aces. That's give yourself all the aces. All right, so I'm going to press on to step two. This is when things start going sideways and I'm going, do I have a problem I need to do something about? And I will speak to this as a training director. When I start hearing things, I'm like, is there a problem or am I just hearing stuff? So how do you know when you have a problem with one of your trainees? Like, is the problem really a problem? And so I think always starting with, have we provided feedback that enhances supervisee competencies and is anchored to collaboratively derived supervision goals? Have we already done that? Because if you haven't, let's start there. And, you know, I think this idea of just having some really good, clear, firm communication can go a long way. At risk of getting myself into trouble, I will tell you, sometimes I call these my come to Jesus talks. I have had them with many trainees where we sit down and I say, hey, I am aware of this behavior. This is a problem. Are you aware it's a problem? This is what you need to do, or this is what you need to not do. And that often solves the problem. So if that gets it done, having clear communication, setting clear expectations, then boy, that's a whole lot easier than getting into the next 5 steps we're going to talk about. So making sure that that happens either by the supervisor or by the training director. I think another important piece of trying to figure out if there's really a problem that you as a training director or a training committee need to step in and address is, are there real signs of distress or dysfunction, right? On the part of the trainee, the supervisors, the training director, the training cohort, so the other trainees, and are we spending more time and energy than usual? Typically, when those things are all percolating up, it is time to start intentionally giving some more focused attention to what's going on. So as you're looking at this, asking the question, are the trainees' competencies below our minimum levels of achievement? If they're not, then I'm not sure remediation should be your first step plan. Could be a developmental issue, could be that there's a supervisor-supervisee mismatch. I think it's really helpful to just remember that all of us, including our trainees, have strengths and weaknesses. And so being able to start looking at whatever the problem is or the concern is an opportunity for growth, maybe having some mentorship, providing extra attention to a certain issue during supervision, and very much focusing on individualized training needs. again, recognizing that the person that you're training is a individual person, and what has worked for you as a training committee or as a supervisor for other students may or may not be what is going to work best for this particular student. Maybe they have other preferences, other better ways of learning. Maybe there are barriers that we aren't even aware of that are impacting their ability to function effectively. And so we need to start asking those questions. And I think, again, that idea of being open and curious and concerned is really the place we want to start from to get a better understanding of what is getting in the way or what the problems are. Another thing as a training director to be doing is making sure the trainee is actually getting adequate supervision. Sometimes they're not functioning because they're not getting enough help. And the minimum amount of scheduled supervision, especially the front end of a training experience, often is not enough. So I think sometimes we have supervisors, I'll speak for myself, who are saying, I'm giving them the supervision I'm supposed to. Okay, yes, you are providing the amount of supervision that you are required to provide to meet the minimum. But sometimes you need to remember that that's a minimum, and sometimes we need to provide more. So I think looking at that is helpful. And then just consider reviewing the training plan. Make any necessary adjustments. Sometimes just thoughtfully making some tweaks goes a really, really long way. And if you're like me and that works, I'd much rather do that than delve into step 5, which I promise we will get to. So if the trainee's competencies are actually below your minimum levels of achievement, which is where you're like, whoa, if we don't get this above here, this trainee is actually going to fail the experience, then you may very well have a problem requiring additional attention. This is when I would really change how I'm thinking about what we need to do next, because now I'm like, wow, if this doesn't get better, we're going to have to fail them. If they're performing below expectations and there's distress, definitely move on to this next step. If their program's spending lots of time and energy and they're not meeting those thresholds, definitely want to head into the next step. And if you have any inkling at all that you are going to have to gatekeep, please proceed. This is not when you do the chat and then you wait and see how things are going to go, if the difference makes sense. So the next step is really sorting out what kind of problem I have so that then we can figure out what we need to do next. So now we have enough reason to concern that we're going to start really proceeding down this path that might take us into formal remediation. So one type of deficit is just a straight up skills deficit. I don't know how to do the thing. And there are lots of reasons people have skills deficits. Often it's because they have not had adequate training. Shocking, right? So these can be just training opportunities and gaps. If a trainee has never had an opportunity to develop a certain skill or is undertrained, we've had lots of conversations in my training director peer groups about lack of assessment experience and skills and report writing and so forth. Maybe working with a special population. Maybe I've never worked with that population before or done that kind of intervention before. These are things we want to put on an individualized training plan and should be a key focus of supervision, but don't necessarily warrant a formal remediation plan. Remediating somebody on a skill that they have never learned, where it can be appropriate to the context of your training environment to teach them that skill, as long as they're developmentally moving along, they can actually start below your minimum threshold. And as long as they're tracking like you want, I would not necessarily put that person on remediation. Critical issue, are there signs of improvement with the feedback and training? If they are, I would proceed. If not, that's when we want to move on to the next step. So another type of problem I would consider a performance deficit. This is where we think they have the skill, but they are not using the skill, or they are not using the skill appropriately. So this is where, again, start by figuring out what's getting in the way. And it is 100% fair to put some responsibility for figuring that out in the lap of the trainee. I don't know if you're familiar with the Harvard Business Review article about the monkeys and who has the monkeys. Sometimes trainees will try to put the monkeys in our office. It's okay to say, no, that's your monkey. And so what is getting in the way for you getting to work on time? It's fair to ask them those questions and have them be the ones solving the problem. It is not your responsibility as a supervisor or training director to necessarily solve that problem for them, but figuring out what's going on. And when it is the responsibility of the training program, making necessary adjustments is appropriate. So is our workload appropriate? Sometimes we give people too much too soon, in which case do we need to scale it back? Are there life stressors in play? Maybe there's some really profound things going on that we didn't know about because we haven't asked, and maybe we want to make some accommodations or adjustments to help them be successful. Are there cultural issues in play? I thought this is what you wanted me to do. This is how I've always been told to do things. You know, I'm going to use an example of being deferential to a supervisor. Some supervisors want to be challenged and engaged, and you bring all of your stuff to me and be super assertive. Well, someone from a culture that is going to be more collectivist and deferential may feel actually quite rude behaving in the way that you are now expecting them to behave. And so then how do we cross those barriers in a way that's going to be successful for everybody, rather than, again, penalizing someone for simply being different? Are there organizational prioritizing skills lacking? This comes up for us all the time as something that gets in the way. And then again, how are those problems going to get addressed and solved? Not necessarily by you, can be by the trainee, but let's identify what the problem is and then get some strategies in place. And another thing that can prevent people from using their skills appropriately, again, is they don't understand the expectations. So this is a good time to slow down, dial it back, and make sure we're clear about what we expect them to do and why, and then give them an opportunity to do that. Much like the previous slide, if we do these things and there's signs of improvement with that feedback and support, if the trainee can address the barriers, let's let them. Let's let that be and move on. If the strategies aren't working or they're not engaging in appropriate strategies, they're not meeting the minimum levels, then we want to move forward to the next step. And then the third type of problems we want to address, or we've decided to call conduct. This is when trainees are just behaving badly. When people are not doing what they're supposed to do, we want to provide clear and direct feedback. Do this, don't do this, make it very plain. If it resolves, throw yourself a party and move on. If it doesn't resolve, I would move on to moving towards formal remediation as soon as possible. Waiting on those things tends not to make things better. Also, though, I think this is a good time to do a good self-check, right? Did I do my part in this to set a healthy and appropriate boundaries and expectations? Have I followed up when I need to follow up? If I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to, that's great. But if I realize, well, maybe I didn't do the thing as well as I would have liked to, then we want to make sure we're doing our part first and then responding to the trainee. I think sometimes there's a pull to like put the trainee at the center of it and make the trainee the bad trainee, and we're all fine, and forget that we can be complicit into behavior problems and things that cause distress and dysfunction within a system. And so we need to make sure we're doing what we're supposed to be doing right first before we start to address that directly with the trainee. I hope that makes sense. You know, and trust me, I mean no judgment, because there are times where I'm like, wow, I wish I had done that better because I'm busy and I'm stressed and I'm doing the best I can and I don't always do it great. And so then I need to take a breath, accept some responsibility, and take some time to do it better. All right. $1 million question. So, but what happens when there's all kinds of problems going on? There's not just one problem. You know, this is usually what we have experienced. If there is someone who is showing deficits and are below minimum levels of achievement, often there's multiple competency concerns or issues. We want to make absolutely sure we're including the entire training committee in these discussions, not just the training director or supervisors, and really looking at if the problems are occurring in a specific context or in a more generalized way. Because again, if there's lots of problems, but it's very focused, that means something different than there's lots of problems everywhere. So that will impact how to proceed. If a trainee is demonstrating lots of problems in lots of areas, I think it is really helpful to slow down and make sure we know where they're not performing the way we would like versus where they are actually below our minimum levels of achievement. Often, what I've experienced is maybe there's a couple areas where they're actually below the threshold for the minimum level of achievement, but many areas we developmentally would expect and want to see them higher than they're at, but they're actually meeting our threshold. My suggestion is that you really focus on the areas that are below your minimum levels of achievement and be thoughtful about how we can support their developmental growth in the other areas. But a remediation plan with everything, including the kitchen sink on it, I think is overwhelming and can be unhelpful both to the trainee and to the training committee. But the critical ones that are below, you're going to want to address. So at this point, I'm just going to say, remember that if you've addressed a problem informally and it resolves, then there really isn't a need to take further action. But if the problems aren't resolved, now is when you're going to need to clearly define which competencies are below those minimum levels of achievement and start to target them for the actual formal remediation. And I'm going to pitch to my colleague, unless there are questions to field before then. Shiloh, are you tracking that?
Yeah, we've been responding in the chat as well.
Awesome. Okay.
So, and just one thing I'd highlight, going back to due process, and I think there was a question in the chat, maybe this will partially address this, kind of what Kristen was alluding to regarding conduct. That's where you can look at your due process, and there may be certain things that are like a don't pass go type of violation, where that's really in your due process of really moving to automatic dismissal. And so to really think about what your due process sets up as to parameters for things, whether that's a bullying of a client, whether that's other decision making that would be in direct violation of the code of conduct of your healthcare system or university. So I just kind of think about in your due process, it really does lay the land for how you can navigate what you do with each of the problems that Kristen identified as well. And as we're even talking about this, I realize this is a bigger, it could be multi-part webinar going on and ongoing consultation. As someone who's done, I counted up at least 10 remediation plans in recent history. I realize each of them are unique and each of them have resulted in a refining of our due process. As I'm like, like this did not, here's a new issue in looking at how we best navigate. So when we reach to step 4, and really we're moving towards like initiating a formal remediation plan, we really want to identify everyone who's involved. And if you've heard us repeatedly talk about referencing due process and making sure you're actually following policies and procedures. That's really good for APA accreditation. If you consult with APA-COA, they'll say, are you following your due process? Are you not necessarily due process, but are you following your policies and procedures? Maybe the language that's utilized and also within your own system as well. And also to really recognize emotions are really likely high for all who are involved, whether that's yourself, supervisors, trainees, the rest of the cohort, that it's not an easy endeavor. And that the urge for us to avoid, as Kristen talked about earlier, is really high. And it's that when I think about it, it's that I would rather have the consequence of my immediate discomfort than the long-term consequence of not being a good gatekeeper or this problem continuing to worsen. And that is what's happened every time I've sat on it. So that helps me push through my threshold. The other thing that helps me to regulate my own emotional response is I've shifted the way I view it as something like, oh, I feel bad that I'm doing this to someone, versus this can be empowering. This is what I'm doing in my role that's hard, and it's a special role that I have and a special opportunity to serve here. And I have had trainees come out of the other side who've written about their remediation plans in their cover letters as career changing. And so it's really about how we approach this as a potentially empowering. That now we're not in control of how the other person responds, but the way we frame it in our own mind, I think matters for how we also engage with our supervisors, with the trainees as well. And so that's really what you're going to see highlighted, is that it's really a collaborative process. And if we can keep it collaborative of clearly defined roles, seeking consultation, being fair and respectful for all involved, and really helping us stand back from emotional reactivity or personal bias, it creates a very trainee-centered, potentially empowering experience. Now, that doesn't mean it feels good or that that's how it always works out, but I think it certainly lays the groundwork for that being the potential opportunity here as well. All right, Kristen, I think I'm ready for the next slide. Okay, so when we're identifying everyone who needs to do what, is to really think about who I want to consult with. And these are just some consultation options to really look at. And I also encourage you to document your consultation. You never know what you're going to need later. It's helpful as reference, but it really can be helpful to like reference back to consultation that you then share with the supervisors or even the trainee. I've even encouraged the trainee to use the APIC IPC consultation as well. It can be great for them on their end to really kind of be getting that support. And then also the notification of any potential stakeholders, like and this is what also your due process, or we're using due process, but really it's part of your overall policies and procedures. And within your system, who are the potential stakeholders and who would be the appropriate chain to notify that there's an issue we're now going to remediate. As well. In ours, if we are going to have an issue, our lead psychologists and our DEO no longer come to certain meetings because we keep that discussion separate in how we're supporting the trainees. So you really want to think about who are my stakeholders in notification and how am I getting good consultation, and then documenting that consultation as well. All right, Kristen. Okay, oh, there we are. And this just lays out who are the potential people who would need to be involved and what we're going to do. And if you think about the training director as like the facilitator, the remediation plan, writing up the plan, that doesn't mean creating it yourself, but that means really leading the remediation plan review meetings, coordinating communication with all is involved, getting us all on the same page, documenting it, making sure we're having our competency updates. Those sorts of elements, the training director is really that kind of fulcrum point as well. And then the supervisors, who all is going to be involved. Sometimes you don't know, like, do we have a goodness of fit here? Can we kind of not necessarily change things up, but is there someone else who's kind of reviewing the work that also are we getting the same kind of evaluative feedback? Do we have potential mismatch? That I found helps the supervisor also feel like, is it just me? What's going on? And another colleague being that it's normative, that another colleague would take a look. And the supervisors I work with call it kind of disbursement of the weight, that not everything hinges on me, but that we're all kind of looking at this, and that it's normative that we may have different opinions on what's going on and how we best help someone as well. So do we need to include other people that aren't actively involved right now? And then we identify like what are the responsibilities of the trainee, of course, and there may be other program staff involvement. We have in our program, we set it up so there's someone else who's a non-evaluative mentor. And so that person sits in on any remediation plan per the trainee request. The trainee can decide not to, and that that person serves as like an advocate for the trainee, of asking hard questions of me. Like, have we considered this? What about this resources? What's going on there? And what trainees have told us is it creates a nice balance of like, it's not us in the room and them. And so that doesn't mean we're not a huge site, but it has created an opportunity to create more collaboration, and trainees have reported positive feedback from it as well. It could also be if they're an intern or practicum student, it could be clinical graduate, the graduate program DCT, or how are we kind of all identifying who's on our team. Sometimes it's just notifying the DCT, and sometimes I've had the DCT be more actively involved in the process as well in terms of supporting the trainee. And then you maintain the documentation as well. So really thinking about your written work. And I find that important for just not just keeping in the competency folder of the trainee and the evolution of the plan, but also in the less statistically probability time that you are going to have to move to dismiss, you have your ducks in a row as well. All right, next slide, Kristen.
Can I just chime in to say one of the things that I learned that saved me on the documentation was the moment I realized it did not have to be fancy or pretty. Like written scribbles with dates and initials and things like that, to just have something on a piece of paper that you can reference later. So it existing is better than it being beautiful or fancy.
All right. So then looking at developing the plan, really thinking, Kristen's hit this earlier, addressing the competency of the individual trainee in a manner that recognize the intersectionality of the trainee. And this is really going to be a nice way of thinking about what the trainee needs, what's gotten in the way, and the voice of the trainee being really recognized, and what we have to adjust in a way that best meets the needs of the trainee as well. And this, sometimes what's come out is, like, I had a trainee and the individual used they, them pronouns. And one of the concerns raised was, I get this feedback, but I'm really activated because the supervisor keeps using the wrong pronouns. And so it's a really good way for us to kind of adjust to what might be getting in the way of further developing the trainee recognizing a need for competency, and the difficulty with the feedback because of the context in which it's given. So how can we help? I support the supervisor in understanding why that matters to the trainee and adjusting behavior. So there's lots of just ways of individual, and this is why individualized plans can be helpful. And this is where kind of Kristen recognizing, like, the template is great and it's just the bones. So the collaborative nature of it also, we really set the tone as well of the input from multiple sides. The trainee director is not developing this in a vacuum, and it's really behaviorally anchored. And we're using a lot of APA language in the minimal levels of achievement, really using behavioral descriptors. And this really helps when I think about supervisors, whether it's dress or anything else, to say, well, I don't like that, to say, help me understand where that ties to the competency. Tie it to the competency for me. What are the behaviors? Versus, I think they should be more professional. Okay, what are the behaviors? What are you seeing that ties the competencies that's a concern? Because that's most useful for everyone. And it helps also check, like, is this style and preference or bias, or is this an actual competency concern? And let's sort that out when we're developing this plan. We also want to utilize our policies and procedures to really think about what's our timeline. How often are we going to be using it to review or meeting to review? I tend to do monthly or every 2 weeks, depending on what timeline of the rotation. And what are the benchmarks? How do we know we've been successful? What is the rating that marks that we've been successful and when? And it's very clear, and it is not a moving target, which increases whenever a target's moving, increases the odds of disempowerment of the process. All right, next slide, Kristen. All right, so looking at being openly and communicating transparency about concerns or mediation process, making sure at the very beginning of your training program that they have a copy of the policies, procedures, that they've read them, that they're aware of, and then this is just a re-review, that there aren't surprises. Being really candid and direct doesn't have to be cruel or aggressive or anything else. It's just clear, that not putting in a validation sandwich where someone has no idea there's a serious issue going on because they didn't get what was in the middle. And also helping that along with the supervisors as well. So you're a little bit middle management in the process of all of this as well. And really the purpose is to support the success of the trainee while also ensuring that minimum levels are achieved. And improvement versus being inherently punitive as well. But also really being clear on the consequence if certain things aren't met. Here's a potential consequence as well. So we don't want to dilute, but that doesn't mean we can't have high empowerment in this process either. Go ahead, Kristen. Okay, so this goes back to collaboration of seeking understanding from the trainee. If I haven't asked for their perspective or what's going on, or tried to understand, or tried to anchor in, specifically asking good Socratic questions such as, what do you think's got in the way? What do you think to be able to learn best? How do you best learn? What's your understanding of the problem? What do you think you kind of would need to do changes behaviorally that would make this better? What additional resources or supports do you think you need? Who else do you think having available to consult with? These are all just kind of thinking about understanding how we set up a really great plan. All right, go ahead, Kristen. And then again, we're anchoring it in the competencies. So I highlighted this a little bit earlier, so I want to leave time for questions. So I won't spend too much time here, but I think we've really said anchor it in the competencies, not personal opinion. All right, go ahead, Kristen. Okay, so this is going to be contents of the plan, and I know we're going to share the slides. So, and this will be recorded, so I won't go over too much of contents, but think of this almost like a checklist. And really kind of, okay, what might be good things for the contents of my plan? And then in the next one, Kristen, and that's kind of contents for good documentation, good lay of the land. And these are then elements. Here are kind of maybe my elements that I would include in a formal plan. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see how these elements are laid out. So then here would be, if I have an element of assessment, writing, and skill, here's my problem behavior of what's going on with the trainee. Then I have expectations of performance, what I would like them to be doing different. Here's what the trainee's responsible for. Here's what the supervisor's responsible for. The time frame for acceptable performance is meet, and I put a blank benchmark there because that will be according to your minimal levels of achievement in terms of your evaluation by end of second quarter evaluation. How are we going to assess this competency? What are our dates of evaluation? Every 3 weeks, and I tend to list the dates and then what was the rating on that date, so I can see the progression over time. And what are the consequences for unsuccessful remediation? Not completing internship. So it's really kind of mapped out elements. And I think Wayne Siegel and some others, I think many a great psychologist has contributed. This is not something we invented ourselves. So I want to give a shout out to work of others and really thinking about how we kind of lay out these different elements as well. And so these last two slides are more as kind of that resource or kind of template, or how do we kind of then anchor it down as well. And I think with our slides, we'll provide a basic template as well as an example. And I think there's also ones on the APIC website. All right, Kristen. All right, Joanna.
Okay, so just keeping an eye on the time. I feel like we've talked about the most important things of our presentation, and this is at the final conclusion at the end of where we're looking at, we've set up the plan, are we following through with the plan? And that could be with scheduled frequent meetings with the trainee, but also with your team. Just, again, a check to make sure, are we looking at the right thing? And are we assessing? How are we assessing? And what is still required? And those are the pieces that can become overwhelming, but it's an opportunity to adjust the plan as needed. You also want to continue to provide support for the trainee, but also remember support for the other members of this remediation plan, because usually you're still just as busy with your day-to-day work requirements. In addition to this, that usually doesn't have budgeted time. So having your team work together, review the potential consequences if not met, making sure that the trainee knows, but also the school as well. Consult, continue to update those that need to be updated, and document are very, very important pieces. Next slide. So again, we're just wanting to follow through with what we said, follow through what the expectations are, reviewing if the minimum competency has been met or displayed, and what has influenced that change or development of skills. So there may have been important things that have made those improvements to both recognize that in the trainee, but also maybe there's things that the supervisor did differently or the team did differently that helped that success. Those would be key things. And when we talk about how we do things differently by learning from experience, we want to keep those things that are helpful moving forward. Continue to provide that trainee with that feedback. Again, document all your letters, communications. If you do decide that you need to dismiss someone, there will need to be information and a request release to APIC match. And so that information is going to be helpful. Also, just keep all that written documentation of outcome. For some, it can be a helpful point to have a termination. So thinking that of it as it's not necessarily a bad thing. We had a plan, we offered these steps, we worked as much as we can, but termination is sometimes the best answer because we've laid out that plan. And that was the outcome. Next slide. That is it from my end. Mine just had 2 little bits, but these are some things we like to talk about in terms of myths and facts about how much we often feel like this takes too much time and that it's a horrible, horrible process. But again, we want to emphasize that this is the view of let us have everyone succeed. What do we need? What are the ingredients? Who are the team members that we need to help this successful process happen? All of us, from training directors to supervisors to trainees, we need to learn how to give difficult feedback and how to follow through. And so some of those pieces are things to remember of it doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be perfect, but we have to continue to walk through all these steps, and starting at the front end is generally the best way to go forward so that everyone is very clear about what the next step would be. I'll turn it over to you, Kristen, if you want to wrap up.
So we are aware we did not leave as much time as we had anticipated, but if there are specific questions, we're happy to take them. We also are willing to share the slides and a couple of resources that we think might be really helpful to people. But my advice to people who have not done remediation or have struggled with remediation is seeking consultation and getting support. I think we all need support. This is hard. It's not fun. But I will agree that have had some very satisfying experiences and outcomes, and actually trainees like Shiloh had mentioned who have come and said, thank you. I was struggling. I needed help. We built a plan, so I got everything that I needed, and then I wasn't stressed anymore and was able to successfully finish the training experience. And so I don't think it has to be experienced as punitive. Stressful, yes, but not punitive. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it, recognizing it's stressful. All right. Thank
you, the 3 of you, for this. All is fantastic information. There was a question early on just about professionalism and violation of professionalism and how that feels different than conduct behavior. I don't know if you can touch on that in 2 minutes or less, but just that was one question that we said we would get back to.
So I think Shiloh had commented a little bit about this. I'm going to agree that sort of knowing where the hard line is, and this is where a trial run, I'm going to go back to the trial run of your due process, maybe running your due process with one type of those problems versus another type to see if it actually works both ways, the way you want it to, could be really helpful so that you can write it in a manner that will work to meet the current need and demand. Because I know we can talk about specific examples, but that's harder with short for time. But I know our due process is built in such a manner that enables our training committee to decide at what level we are going to take action, with a preference to start at a lower level, but not a requirement. And it's very explicit about, depending on how egregious the behavior is, the level that we start to consequence you may be higher. And so it creates room for that. And I think one of the things I would be cautious about is trying to be so explicit that we include all of the things. That's how you end up with dress code saying you can't wear a feather boa to work. That's not necessary. I think giving yourself some reason to be able to have some discretion to look at the severity of the behavior, the consequences for patient care. But man, if you're wondering about that, I would run your due process through mock with both types of problems and see if maybe it works for one type of problem, but not the other. And that's when you want to make an adjustment.
Right. Well, Kristen, Joanna, and Shiloh, I learned so much from listening to you all walk through these steps. Thank you so much for your time. this afternoon and sharing all you know and your experience in this area. I believe the recording and the slides as well will be up on APIC's website very shortly. Shona's nodding her head. So yeah, so that's where you can find the slides as well. I think that's it. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Have a wonderful weekend. Awesome. Jeff, who do you want to get the slides?
I have to run, go give a CPT training for the rest of the day. Okay.
Go do that. Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye all.
Thanks, y'all. Jeff,
You're on mute.
I'm going to go because I have to head out for something else.